In this video, I'm going to talk about the importance of writing good user stories and how, if you get these right, it can help data engineers to modernize their workflow to utilize CI/CD. In my role as a data consultant, I get to work with a lot of teams working on a lot of different projects. And I'm starting to see a real shift towards modern software development practices that incorporate fast feedback, failing fast, through continuous integration and continuous development. Modern data software engineers and data scientists and data modelers are demanding tools that help them enable and tackle the technical fixes to a infrastructure, configuration management or software control problem. This modernization enables the human to tackle the problem at hand rather than spending all their time and effort trying to fix a bug in a piece of code. Projects often fail to deliver real value because the requirement process is broken, not the tools. Gathering a list of requirements often turns into compiling a list to do, rather than focusing in on what the client needs, what the user needs, and what the outcome should be. This is not a very good way of delivering value to the end user and often creates its own problems. So how can we avoid some of these pitfalls and how can we deliver data solutions faster? There are a variety of different requirement types, and in my experience, these often get confused, muddled up, or not documented at all. So what are the types of requirements? Well, the first and most obvious one is a business requirement, and this will be an objective or something the business is trying to achieve. So it could be how to improve customer retention by 15% over the next year. Business requirements often look to change the way the business or the business processes work. Stakeholder requirements often refer to positions within your business or within the business process. It could be a manager within a sales team, or it could be the agent within the business team. It could even be a customer or client. And the kinds of stakeholder requirements will allude to giving somebody access to data, enabling somebody to do something. Functional requirements. Functional requirements are how you expect the system to work, how you'd expect the UI to operate. These often express the solution will give us these kinds of functions, they enable us to do these kinds of activities. The next thing we have is non-functional requirements, and non-functional requirements often refer to constraints or quality objectives you have for your solution. So this will be things like how well it's going to perform, how much it's going to be able to scale, what security you're going to put in place around the whole solution. An example of this would be the system must enable 1,000 concurrent users to interact with the solution at any one point in time. Technical requirements. Technical requirements often refer to how you're going to provision the solution. So it could be the platform that you're looking to utilize, it could be the integrations that you must have, or the systems that you need to interact with to, say, collect data. We have regulatory or compliance requirements. So if you're working in a business where you're regulated, you may have legal obligations, you can have compliance obligations that you must incorporate into the business or into the solution. And this could be, and is famously, a GDPR or personally identifiable data requirement where you might have to have additional securities or you might have to conform with certain laws. User requirements, and user requirements refer to how you want people to interact with the solution. In my experience, when I'm looking at requirements that have been built to build a new data solution or data analytics solution, I often find that the requirements just don't satisfy what the end goal is. For instance, if the requirement is you must collect all of the data from the CRM to produce a dashboard, that's too vague. That doesn't explain what the end goal is and even how people are going to interact with the data. It doesn't explain what the CRM is, where you're going to be able to get the data, what intervals are going to collect the data from. Equally, building a list of tasks to bring in data from the CRM is not going to drive value. Just going to a data source, collecting the data into a database only goes so far. How are you going to try and drive value from these requirements? We want to avoid spending time and effort building things that don't add value and don't meet our end goal. On the other hand, over-detailed plans leaving very little room for collaboration can often restrict how the end solution is going to be fully realised and can cut off paths that you could explore that might produce a better product or solution. As a whole, over-detailed plans can often be inflexible, flat, and be hard to steer around potential problems that you haven't foreseen at the start of the project. Having a list of requirements that have no perceived value to the end business can add massive risk to your project. My preferred approach to this is to specify what we're trying to achieve. What does done look like? And how do we build a set of steps to build the blue sky solution? There's a very good book by Lawrence Core on modeling for business intelligence. I highly recommend anyone read this, as it helps you to understand the business events and analysis for modeling data. So the BEAM methodology has helped me out a huge amount, and I've built my own teams before using these principles, and every time I build a team around this book, it always drives value, and it also helps my team become better at deriving real requirements that are going to add value and steer away from a list of to-dos that are going to drive no value from the business whatsoever. The best thing to do is to start off with a vague wish list to help paint the picture of what done looks like. This creates an opportunity for you to work through the user stories and requirements to better understand them in collaboration with the stakeholders. It also gives you the opportunity to work through examples of how the requirement will demonstrate value in the end solution. This also helps you build acceptance tests, so you can then start to ensure that the solution meets the requirements from a testing standpoint. This approach is more likely to provide a successful outcome for everyone involved. The collaboration enables the stakeholders to see your progress as you go through the project, but also they can see the value and be collaborated with should there be problems and issues that you need to work through as part of the process. User stories, or stories, are the starting point of this entire process, and they are the starting point for a conversation. Once you understand what done looks like, what you're trying to deliver, you need to work through the user stories to exhaust all potential eventualities, and also to collaborate with the business users. A development team working on user stories by themselves will not guarantee any success and could end up providing you with a false positive and an outcome or a solution that doesn't fully realize the value the customer was expecting. The objective of a good user story is to document the requirements at a higher level of abstraction, so it's well enough understood by both parties what we're trying to achieve without detailing how to achieve it. Leave the delivery of the solution to the data team. The development team, or the data development team, their responsibility is to work through the use case and uncover and explore any issues, and then collaborate back to the business team to understand how to either resolve the issue or work around the issue. We encourage them to have as many conversations as necessary to do that, to understand at a greater degree or technical degree how to overcome the issues. Remember, good user story is the North Star, and the data development team are the navigators. So you point them in the right direction on the map, and the data team will move through and take you on the journey to get to the end goal. So now we've understood a little bit more about use cases, let's build a few use cases and record them in our Git repository. So here we are within our GitHub repository, but before we go into the requirements, let me show you how I've configured our organization settings to record our issue types slightly differently. So I'm hopping over to settings, going into planning, going into issue types, and in here you can see we've defined issue types to include user stories and acceptance testing. Now the alternative to using issue types is to build labels, but we find that we want to use a consistent way of tagging our issue types across all projects, across all repositories within our organization. Of course, you can do it in different ways, but this is just one way you can use. So I've hopped back to our repository and I'm going to go into create a new issue. So here's our brand new issue, and I've already pre-populated the title. So we got the total sales per order. So that's our user story. Inside of the description, we've added in the context, the information that everyone has agreed upon. So as a managing director, I want to understand the total sales per order date so I can identify daily sales trends and peak performance period. So this again is a well-defined top level requirement. We've got a role being the managing director, so somebody who wants to see this. That can come into play later when we do technical requirements. We've also got some information that we're going to use for total sales and per order date, so it's starting to allude to how we might model the data, and we can see what kind of analysis that person's going to do with this data at a future date, and that can help us when we come to build any analytics and dashboards. So now we've built out and described our requirement, we can go and tag it up as a user story type. We can add any labels we see fit, we can assign it to people. If we're using projects, we can assign projects, and also milestones for when these things need to be created. So if we click on create and we head back to our issue list, where you can see I've already created all of the issues, all of my example issues. We've got some repeating issues here where we've got total sales by product, by customer, by person. We have some for total number of sales, and all the user stories have been defined and they've been broken down into just good enough user stories to help us build out a fact and dimension star schema. The other thing that you can see here is we've added in acceptance testing. So if I go into one of these, you can see that we have the same user story title being used, but of course we've used acceptance testing as the issue type. Again, you can use different ways of doing this. This is just one example. And in here, we've got some criteria for what is acceptable based on this. And of course, it starts to allude to some of the other things we're going to do in the project as far as visualization is concerned. And we can come on to that at a later time. So now we have everything inside of our GitHub issues, and we're ready to start the coding and start to work towards turning these user stories into an actual solution. One of the mistakes I often see is creating user stories that are far too wide or far too complex. Epics like this can often have an appeal because they're simple and easy to create. However, they often lack the clarity defining the scope and what needs to happen. So if you have a user story that can be broken down, then the chances are that user story is far too big. Instead, look to create meaningful user stories that are well defined and have the detail and accuracy in capturing what you're trying to deliver. These user stories are easier to define acceptance criteria against, and if you're struggling to create acceptance criteria, that suggests that your user story isn't quite right. Big or overcomplicated, over-detailed user stories can derail project, and if you can find a way of splitting these down, do that to make sure they're well defined and meaningful, but don't split user stories down for splitting's sake. Instead, just make sure you keep things relevant and make sure each user story provides value. The next common failure is when the user story actually defines technical changes rather than business outcomes or value. The idea is the data engineering team is responsible for delivering the solution, and we shouldn't be telling them exactly what we want from where we want. We can inform them about where the data might be, but we shouldn't say how things need to calculate unless there's something specific that they wouldn't necessarily know that we need to inform them to get the result. It's important to remember that modern data engineers have tools that help to navigate paths through and around problems and issues. They also have skills and techniques that will avoid them from spending a lot of time working on specific technical issues and to get to the solution quicker. We don't want to bog them down with additional hoops and loops to jump through. The next thing is to confuse a data platform or analytical tool with a user story. Understanding what a user needs to achieve with the data is important and should be part of a user story, but selecting the tool and the way that they would process and interact with that tool is not something that should be considered a user story. A selection criteria for what the data tool, the analytical tool does, needs to be a completely different project. After all, the IT team or the technical team that deliver the solution should have already considered things like IT security, governance, how the organization wants to provision data or solutions out to users. That needs to be controlled by the IT team in its entirety. So asking a user what they want to try and do within the user story, such as I want to look at the sales over time, I want to look at, I want to find out my peak time, my peak performance times. That is a perfectly valid user story. Of course, designing reports and dashboards within analytical tools are perfectly valid, but when we build and model data out, should be agnostic of what the end tool is capable of doing. After all, we're now starting to work in a world where it's not just analytical tools that interact with the data, but it's things like LLMs. So now when new modern tools come up, we are not worried about how much we need to change the data model in order to serve the analytical tool, because if we've done it right, the data model itself should be able to flex and change with the tool that's being used to interact with the data. That then reduces the need to do any further acceptance testing, because the acceptance testing that you've built for your data model will then be applicable to any tool that uses that data. This separation is important. It frees up your time and it gives you the ability to innovate and to move and create impactful changes with minimal risk to the end user. To summarize and to give you some top tips, use user stories as a tool for collaboration. Create a common language between the business team and the technical team that help to describe the direction of travel and the value you're trying to create in terms that everyone can understand. But most importantly, connects the business team with the delivery team to ensure that if there are any bumps in the road, we smooth them out as quickly as possible, but also to drive the most value. Building a good working relationship between the technical and non-technical team, the IT delivery team or engineering team and the business team will help you in the long run. Not only will it provide constant updates on the progress of the innovation or project or solution you're building, but it also helps you alleviate any issue as well as improve value if there's an opportunity to do so. An open dialogue for conversation is a much better way of working between teams. The last thing, stories help us to guide prioritization, planning, acceptance testing and building, and builds a shared understanding between all the people involved in building that solution. Ultimately, this will reduce the amount of time it takes to build really good solutions quickly. Remember, user stories aren't just a simple way of writing down a list of tasks. They're about identifying goals, real values, and helping to build solutions that change and innovate. In our next video, I will be using Wescape 3D to model out data using our use cases that we built out in this video and to work through those requirements in a modern CI/CD workflow that helps us drive towards our end solution.